Hello, it's John Heaton, and today I'm going to review a Roger Waters album called Amused to Death, released September 7th, 1992. And this is my vinyl, which I picked up just a couple of years ago. I only had it on CD, and it was in my local Media Mart here, going for about £20 for a double album. So I bought it, and then I went back a couple of weeks later and the same album was selling for £40, so I think it was another case of mistaken pricing. Wasn't complaining. This is the back cover. Got the lyrics. This is, in my opinion, Roger's finest solo effort. I think Roger thinks that himself as well. Pros and Cons of Hitchhiking was patchy, had its moments, but as a concept didn't really work tremendously well, in my opinion. Radio Chaos, same, not a bad concept, but just not very consistent in terms of material and not a very cohesive piece. This one is altogether more together in terms of concept and musically. It's a 72-minute, 45-second album, so about the length of a double album in, if you think albums used to last 35, 36 minutes, nowadays they tend to last longer, but in the olden days. So when this came out, when it came out on vinyl, it was obviously going to be a double. Jeff Beck is on guitar duties. Quite interesting that Roger uses Eric Clapton on Pros and Cons and Jeff Beck on this one. Can't remember who plays on Radio Chaos. I think it might be Jeff Beck as well. Andy Fairweather Low features, and he's played live with Roger throughout the years. Great guitarist. I was interested to know that Roger wanted to include some spoken excerpts from 2001: Space Odyssey, but Stanley Kubrick refused him permission because Pink Floyd, in turn, had refused permission to use music from Atom Heart Mother in the film Clockwork Orange. So I wasn't aware that they'd even asked Pink Floyd for music for that film. It's already a tremendous film. I don't know if it would have made it even more memorable. I'm not sure which tracks were Stanley wanted to use. Roger's on record as saying he's been involved in two absolutely classic albums, Dark Side of the Moon and The Wall. But he says if you haven't heard Amused to Death, you haven't really seen the complete picture, and he thinks that's his third masterpiece. Well, it's not quite on a par with those great Pink Floyd albums, but it's by far and away, in my opinion, the strongest solo album from any member of Pink Floyd. Certainly Roger's strongest. Lyrically, obviously, it's Roger is much stronger than Dave Gilmour. I think my son Richie would argue that Dave Gilmour's first two solo albums are his favourites, but I think his second one in particular is decent. But I think Amused to Death, for me, is Roger's best solo album, and as I say, the best album produced outside of the group, and that includes post Waters Floyd, by the way, in my opinion. Got to number 8 in the UK, first top 10 album for Roger in the UK, and number 21 in the US. I don't know, let me see, let's go through the tracks. Anything else to say here? Opens with a very moving spoken passage from Alf Razell from the Royal Fusiliers, who's recounting a scene in the trenches or I think it's World War II, so it wouldn't be the trenches, although he does talk about no man's land. But he leaves his friend Bill Hubbard, who's injured, and Bill Hubbard's saying, leave me, I want to die." And Alf reluctantly has to leave him, and he says he'll never be found, and I'm not sure if he was found, but Bill died. And Alf Razell is really feeling guilty for the rest of his life. So this was probably put in, Roger's own father was killed in World War II in 1944. So this was probably symbolic of that. But the overall concept of the album is not so much about anti-war like the final cut. It's more from, well, it is that, but it's also the greed of man who tends to put money before morals. I would say that's one of the themes of the album. Roger is not known for his spiritual convictions, so What God Wants is a very cynical song about what God wants, God gets, God help us all. Basically, it's God's fault that what's happened. If God does exist, it's his fault that what's happened to the world, which is quite a controversial viewpoint. It's not a bad song, but I think he'd covered this topic with a bit more humour on a song called Deja Vu off his latest album, which, by the way, is a strong album. Not quite as strong as this, but a strong album. Perfect Sense is a good song and works very well in a live context. I've seen Roger do songs from this album very effectively live, twice in Budapest, including that Perfect Sense when that chorus, it all makes perfect sense, expressed in dollars and cents, pounds, shillings and pence. It's just made for a stadium crowd, really. And the bravery of being out of range, possibly the best track on the album, talking about having a dig at probably US military who used to fire smart bombs and stuff at targets with no fear of repercussion of being hit in return, so basically firing from such a distance that there was no chance of getting shot down. So Rogers, throughout his career, has always been left of centre politically. In fact, I don't often agree with him politically, but he's entitled to his opinion, and it's very persuasively written. His views and his lyrics are powerful. As I say, you don't have to necessarily agree with them. And one of the early songs here has some slightly simplistic lyrics, and the Germans killed the Jews, and the Jews killed the Arabs, and the Arabs killed the hostages, and that is the news. So Roger is pretty staunchly anti-Israel and keeps on going on about that topic. And later on in another song, you don't have to be a Jew to disapprove of murder. So he's not anti-Semitic or anything, but he's just anti-Israel and or pro-Palestine. So it's quite controversial, but it's good stuff lyrically, and it's powerfully written and powerfully delivered. Too Much Rope is another powerful song with the hook line, give any one species too much rope and they'll fuck it up. Let me see, What God Wants comes in for another reprise. Then we turn over to side 3 and we get part 3 of God Wants, which is different from the first two and has some glorious production. I think Michael Kamen had a hand in that. Some glorious guitar solo from Jeff Beck. Watching TV is about the girl in Tiananmen Square, I think, who stood in front of the tank. By the way, events which the Chinese government deny happen to this day, but that song is about that. A very pleasant song. 3 Wishes is another nice song. Roger gets good support from several female vocalists on this album, including Katie Kassoon and others. Turn over to side 4 and we've got It's a Miracle, which has some amusing lyrics about, we've got Pepsi in the Andes, we've got McDonald's in Tibet. He's having a go at American commercialism, as he normally is. It's funny how Roger's albums are always him being negative about something. You won't find him singing the glories of love or romance, not very often anyway. You won't find him writing silly love songs for sure. So it gets a little bit samey because when you hear him in interviews, he's actually quite an amusing guy. And I'm sure if you met him in a pub, he's actually got a good sense of humour. But if you listen to his lyrics or try to figure out his character from his lyrics alone, you'd conclude that he was a very down in the dumps, negative thinking individual. But I guess that's his trademark, and we wouldn't want him to change and suddenly write soppy love songs after all these years, would we? It's a Miracle has the interesting, if cruel, line at the end. And with our hands over our ears, Lloyd Webber's awful stuff runs for years and years and years and years. An earthquake hits the theatre, but the operator lingers. Then the piano lid comes down and breaks his fucking fingers. It's a Miracle. So I don't think Roger is a particular fan of Lloyd Webber, Andrew Lloyd Webber, who wrote all his musicals. I can stomach some of his stuff. In fact, his early stuff was great, like Joseph and Jesus Christ Superstar, and Evita to a lesser extent. But I guess after that he got a bit predictable for me. But Roger's really got it in for him. But it's quite amusing. So there is some humour on this album. It's not all doom and gloom. You get the lyrics, and it really does repay concerted listening. Roger's albums and Roger's lyrics. I mean, this is an album which I think works best to sit down, as I did recently, and just listen to it from start to finish. It's not really one to dip in and out of and play one track and go on to something else, like people tend to do these days with the random selection or the Spotify. So this is another example of the validity of the concept of an album and how a set of songs hang together very well and really don't mix easily with songs elsewhere from Roger's career. And that's true of most of Roger's work. I think it's best, if you're going to listen to a Roger album, whether it's a solo album or whether it's an album like Animals, which he dominated lyrically, then listen to it in of itself and don't sort of skimp around and play highlights. So that's a bit of advice from my experience of what's been good in terms of enjoying Roger Waters' music and lyrics. It's got some nice melodies on this album, very strong lyrics as always. And as I say, it's not quite as good as those epic Pink Floyd efforts, or not even as good as the final cut probably, but definitely worthy of investigation, and as I say, is his strongest effort after he left Pink Floyd. Thanks for watching. See you next time.